There's something oddly fascinating about the way the internet talks about generations. Boomers get blamed for everything, millennials get analyzed like a cultural case study, and Gen Z gets examined in real time like a live social experiment. But then there's Gen X, sitting quietly in the background, barely discussed, rarely centered, almost treated like a forgotten hallway between two loud rooms. And that's strange, because Gen X may be one of the most psychologically revealing generations alive. Born roughly between the mid-1960s and early 1980s, they grew up in a world that felt less padded, less supervised, and far less emotionally translated for children. They were expected to adapt before anyone asked whether adaptation had a cost. A lot of them came home to empty houses. No text from mom, no location sharing, no camera at the front door. No one asking whether they had eaten, whether the walk home felt scary, whether something happened at school that day. They opened the door, entered silence, and learned to make that silence feel normal. That experience does something to a brain. When you're young, repeated emotional environments become internal blueprints. If the message of childhood is handle it yourself, eventually the brain stops expecting rescue. It gets efficient, it gets observant, it gets practical, but it also gets careful about needing anybody too much. That's one of the great misunderstandings about Gen X. People often see their distance and assume coldness. They see their self-containment and assume emotional detachment. But a lot of the time, what looks like indifference is actually adaptation. What looks like aloofness is often old training, because Gen X learned early that vulnerability was not always met with softness. It was often met with "deal with it," "you're fine," or "stop being dramatic." So instead of becoming louder, many became more internally managed. They turned emotion into something private, processed quietly, often wrapped in humor, sarcasm, or understatement. That humor wasn't random, it was protective technology. If you can make the room laugh first, you control the emotional temperature. If you can turn pain into irony, pain loses some of its authority. If you can shrug before someone dismisses you, then at least the rejection feels partially authored. And that pattern shows up everywhere in Gen X behavior. In work, in relationships, in parenting, in conflict. They often move through life with a specific kind of guarded competence, like people who trust themselves more than systems and trust systems more than promises, but trust promises the least. That mindset didn't appear out of nowhere. Gen X grew up watching institutions wobble. They saw divorce rates rise, corporate loyalty collapse, political trust fracture, and public authority lose its shine. The world kept saying this structure will protect you, while the evidence kept whispering, maybe not. So they became translators of instability. They learned to read the fine print under every promise. They learned that just because something sounds secure doesn't mean it's safe. And over time, that creates a person who may seem skeptical, but is often just highly trained in disappointment prevention. This is why Gen X often comes across as realistic to themselves and cynical to everyone else. They're not usually pessimistic for theatrical reasons. They're not performing darkness to seem deep. They simply grew up in conditions that rewarded emotional preparedness more than blind optimism. And if you really want to understand them, pay attention to their relationship with privacy. Gen X came of age before personal branding became normal, before every thought needed an audience, before awkward phases became searchable forever. Their mistakes could still disappear. Their identities had room to be unfinished in peace. That matters more than people realize. When you grow up without a digital mirror reflecting you back every second, you develop a different self. Less performative, less curated, sometimes less validated, yes, but also less fragmented by constant observation. There was more room to just exist without broadcasting existence. So when people say Gen X is private, it's not because they don't get modern sharing culture. A lot of them understand it perfectly. They just don't confuse visibility with intimacy. To them, being seen by everyone can feel dangerously close to being known by no one. There's another layer too. Gen X was raised during a strange mix of freedom and threat. They had more unsupervised independence than many children today, but that freedom existed beside cultural anxiety, crime fears, economic uncertainty, and the long shadow of geopolitical tension. Independence didn't feel soft, it felt earned. That's why so many Gen X adults have a calm under-pressure quality that can seem almost eerie. In a crisis, they often become intensely functional, not because stress doesn't affect them, but because early life taught them that panic is rarely useful and help may not arrive on schedule. The cost, of course, is hyper self-reliance can slowly become a prison. If you always solve everything alone, asking for help starts to feel unnatural, then embarrassing, then weak, then impossible. Competence becomes identity, and identity becomes a cage that nobody else can even see. And this is where Gen X overlaps beautifully with younger audiences today, especially teenagers and young adults who feel emotionally misunderstood. Because under the dry humor, under the self-control, under the "I'm fine" posture, there is often the same human wish that shows up in every generation: to feel safe enough to unclench. That's the bridge. Teenagers today may express pain more openly, while Gen X often buried it faster, but the need underneath is not so different. Both want understanding without humiliation. Both want room to be imperfect without feeling socially disposable. And maybe that's why Gen X still feels strangely important right now. They remember the analog world, but they survived the digital one. They understand boredom, silence, delayed answers, physical effort, and private thought, but they also adapted to technological acceleration without making that adaptation their whole personality. They became a kind of psychological hinge generation, old enough to remember when information took work, young enough to learn new systems quickly, skeptical enough to question authority, practical enough to keep showing up anyway. Not flashy, not loudly self-mythologizing, just quietly durable. And quiet durability is easy to miss. It doesn't trend, it doesn't advertise itself, it usually doesn't demand applause. But whole families, workplaces, and communities have been held together by people exactly like this. People who kept functioning, kept helping, kept adapting, and rarely paused to narrate how hard that actually was. So no, Gen X is not emotionless. They are often emotionally edited. They are not disengaged from life. They are frequently engaged in ways that are less visible, less verbal, and less interested in performance. Their psychology makes sense once you stop judging it by louder generational standards. They are the people who learn to survive without much witnessing, love without much spectacle, and work without expecting applause. And while that survival style can create distance, it can also create depth, loyalty, resourcefulness, and a surprisingly tender kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself. Maybe the real story of Gen X is not that they were forgotten. Maybe it's that they became so good at carrying weight without complaint that the world stopped noticing they were carrying anything at all. And once you see that, their silence doesn't look empty anymore. It looks earned. If this resonated with you, then maybe you already understand the deeper point. Some people don't look wounded because they healed perfectly. They look unwounded because they learned very early how to hide the bruise while still doing the job. And that, in many ways, is peak Gen X.